It was a crisp fall morning in a small Midwestern town, the kind where everyone knew each other, and the pulse of daily life was steady and predictable. John Harrison, a 45-year-old businessman, woke up at 5:30 a.m., as he did every weekday. His phone buzzed with a reminder about his flight later that day, a business trip to the big city to close a deal that had been months in the making. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just another day in his routine life. His home was modest, a 2-story house on a quiet street, and his career was in a stable place. John had always prided himself on being a man who worked hard, kept his opinions to himself, and maintained a simple, practical lifestyle. He dressed quickly, opting for a navy blue blazer, a crisp white shirt, and his favorite red MAGA hat, a symbol of his political beliefs that had become a signature part of his look over the past few years. As he glanced at himself in the mirror, he adjusted the hat just so, feeling a sense of pride. Today, he would face a room full of executives, and he wanted to make a statement, not just in business, but in how he carried himself. John was used to the mixed reactions his hat sparked. Some saw it as a political statement, others as an expression of identity. But for him, it wasn't just about politics, it was about standing firm in his convictions. He didn't go out of his way to provoke, but when asked, he was always clear about where he stood. It wasn't something he hid, and as he walked out the door, he felt confident in his decision. The drive to the airport was smooth, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over the empty roads. He drove with the windows down, listening to talk radio, the voice of a conservative pundit discussing the latest political developments. John felt at home in this world, where ideas aligned with his own were celebrated and reinforced. His car hummed along, the miles ticking by as the airport loomed closer. It was a busy day for travel, with several flights heading to major cities for various business, leisure, and personal reasons. When he arrived at the airport, John parked his car and grabbed his carry-on bag. He joined the steady stream of travelers heading into the terminal. He wasn't the most frequent flyer, but the airport felt like a second home, familiar, predictable, and filled with the hum of bustling travelers. John went through security without a hitch, quietly enduring the routine checks and metal detectors. He always made sure to arrive early, giving himself time to breathe before the flight. As he entered the waiting area, John found a quiet spot near the window. He settled into one of the plastic chairs, watching the planes taxiing on the runway. The steady hum of engines and the overhead announcement of boarding calls became the soundtrack to his thoughts. He had been preparing for this meeting for weeks, and as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was different today. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the airport, usually a place of calm before travel, felt tense. John took off his jacket and sat back, pulling out his phone to check emails. A few minutes later, he was interrupted by a voice calling his name. "Mr. Harrison," the voice rang out. He looked up and saw a flight attendant walking toward him. She was a woman in her 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a pleasant smile, but there was something about the way she was looking at him that made him uneasy. She had the kind of polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes?" John replied, standing up and adjusting his hat, assuming she was just doing a final check of the passenger list. "I'm sorry, but we're having a small issue with your boarding pass," the attendant said, still smiling. "Could you please follow me for a moment?" John furrowed his brow. This wasn't typical. He hadn't experienced any issues with his boarding pass in years of travel. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "I'll explain in just a moment," she replied, her voice clipped, almost dismissive. "Please, if you could come with me." John followed her, a little confused, but still not too concerned. He had seen flight attendants move passengers around before when there were seating issues or last-minute changes. But as they walked toward the gate, John noticed that other passengers were staring at him, some with curious glances, others with an almost judgmental look. It made him feel uncomfortable, but he couldn't quite place why. They reached the gate, where another attendant was waiting. This one was slightly older, with short-cropped gray hair. She was standing behind a desk, and she, too, gave him an odd look. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "we've had a situation come up regarding your boarding. I'm afraid you won't be allowed to board this flight." John's confusion deepened. "I don't understand," he said. "I've got a confirmed seat, a boarding pass, and I'm ready to go. Why can't I board?" The flight attendant glanced at the woman who had escorted him, who gave a subtle nod. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow you to board today," she said, her voice now more stern. "You're wearing a MAGA hat, and it's against our policy to allow any form of political statements on board." John's face flushed with both surprise and anger. "What?" he spat, incredulous. "You can't be serious." "I am," the attendant replied, with no room for negotiation. "This is a company policy to ensure a safe and comfortable flight for all passengers. We've had incidents before, and we can't risk any further disruption." John stood there, stunned. His mind raced. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had been flying for years, and never in all that time had anyone ever questioned his clothing or political views. His MAGA hat, for him, was just a symbol of who he was, a man who believed in certain values. But now it seemed that his mere presence with that hat was enough to spark conflict. "This is ridiculous," John muttered, shaking his head. "You're going to deny me boarding over a hat? This is discrimination." The older attendant looked at him coldly. "It's not about discrimination. It's about maintaining a peaceful environment on our flights. We can't have any political symbols disrupting the safety and comfort of our passengers. If you refuse to comply, we may have to escalate this further." John's pulse quickened. His frustration was building. "This is wrong," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to a supervisor." The two attendants exchanged looks, clearly aware that this situation was escalating. They turned to make the call, but as they did, John could feel the eyes of other passengers on him. Some were watching with sympathy, others with disapproval. He didn't care about them, not really. But the whole ordeal felt like a violation of his rights. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't shouting or demanding anything unreasonable. He was simply a man with an opinion, trying to go about his day. Minutes later, the supervisor arrived, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a crisp uniform with the airline's logo on it. He looked at John and the attendants before turning to the counter to read the reports. The tension in the air was palpable. John was ready to explode, but he tried to keep his composure. He wasn't going to let them treat him like this without a fight. "I'm sorry, sir," the supervisor said, clearly uncomfortable, "but our policy stands. You won't be allowed to board with that hat." John's frustration boiled over. "This is unbelievable," he shouted. "You're telling me I can't board a flight because of my political beliefs? This is America." The supervisor's voice remained calm but firm. "I understand your frustration, sir. But we have rules in place for the safety and comfort of all passengers. I'm afraid you'll need to leave the gate." John's mind raced. He could feel his blood pressure rising, and he was about to argue further when something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" It was a man, older but with an air of authority. He was tall, with a sharp suit and an air of confidence that made everyone pause. His face was vaguely familiar to John, but it wasn't until the man stepped forward and looked at him directly that he realized who he was. "Richard Stone," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm the CEO of this airline. What seems to be the problem?" John was stunned. The CEO of the airline, standing in front of him. It took a moment for the shock to wear off, but when it did, a strange realization hit him. This wasn't just a regular passenger issue. It was something Richard Stone's presence was commanding. The moment he stepped forward, there was an immediate shift in the room. Everyone seemed to straighten up a little, as if they suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. John, still in a state of shock, tried to process what was happening. The CEO of the airline? Standing right in front of him? He had no idea how to react. It wasn't every day you found yourself in a confrontation with the person at the very top of the company. Richard Stone extended his hand toward John, and for a moment, John hesitated before shaking it. "I'm sorry you're having trouble with your boarding," Richard said, his voice smooth and composed. "Let's clear this up." John, though still rattled by the situation, found a flicker of clarity. The last few minutes had been a blur, his anger, the accusations about his hat, the sense of injustice. Now, standing before the man in charge, John realized he was in the middle of something that could spiral out of control if he didn't play his cards right. "Look," John said, his voice tight with frustration. "I don't know what's going on here, but this is absurd. I've been flying for years and never had an issue. Now, because I'm wearing a hat, I'm being told I can't board? This is America, not some authoritarian regime." Richard Stone looked at him for a long moment, then glanced at the two attendants who had brought John to the gate. There was an awkward silence as the attendants shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Harrison," Stone said, nodding slowly. "But there are rules in place to ensure that all of our passengers feel safe and comfortable. We've had situations before where certain symbols or attire caused disruptions. We try to avoid that as much as possible." John's anger flared again, but he bit his lip. "So because of my hat, I'm not allowed to fly?" he asked incredulously. "What about everyone else on this flight? What if someone has a sign supporting another politician? Should they be kicked off too?" Bigger. Something far beyond what he had imagined. Stone paused, the weight of the question hanging in the air. "It's not about politics," he said slowly. "It's about ensuring that passengers don't feel threatened or uncomfortable. We take pride in offering a neutral, peaceful environment for everyone." The words felt rehearsed, calculated. They didn't resonate with John. "So now I'm a threat? Because I'm wearing a hat that expresses my opinion?" he shot back, his voice rising. "You're telling me that I'm causing a problem for people I've never even met?" Stone's expression softened slightly, but he didn't back down. "It's not about you being a threat, Mr. Harrison. It's about maintaining decorum. We don't want anyone to feel alienated or intimidated. I'm sure you can understand that." John shook his head. The more Stone spoke, the more John felt as though his rights were being trampled on. It wasn't just the denial of boarding. It was the idea that his personal beliefs could be seen as a threat, something to be suppressed for the greater good. His mind raced, and he couldn't stop thinking about the larger implications. What if this wasn't an isolated incident? What if the world was heading down a path where free expression was being slowly chipped away at, one small step at a time? "I understand your position," John said, his voice now cold and composed, "but I don't think you do. What you're doing isn't just about a hat. It's about telling people that their opinions don't matter unless they conform to some arbitrary standard of what's acceptable." Richard Stone's face remained neutral, though his eyes held a flicker of something. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps empathy. But whatever it wasn't enough to change the situation. "I don't want this to escalate, Mr. Harrison," Stone said. "I'm offering you a chance to board, but not with that hat. If you're willing to comply, we'll make this as smooth as possible. Otherwise, we'll have to ask you to leave the gate area." John took a deep breath, weighing his options. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about standing up for something. If he gave in now, it would feel like surrender. If he stood his ground, the fallout could be more than he bargained for. But there was something inside him that couldn't back down. He had lived his life according to a certain set of beliefs, and this felt like an attack on those beliefs. The idea that his hat could be the cause of such a dramatic confrontation seemed too absurd to let slide. "You want me to take off my hat," John said slowly, "and pretend that nothing is wrong. You want me to act like I don't have a right to wear it, just to keep things easy. But that's not going to happen. I'm not going to apologize for wearing this. If that's the price for getting on your flight, then I'll pass." There was a long, tense pause. Stone's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, John wondered if he had just made a massive mistake. But then, Richard Stone spoke again, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "Mr. Harrison, I'm offering you a solution. You can get on the flight, but not with that hat on. If you can't accept that, then we have nothing more to discuss." The moment hung in the air like a thread ready to snap. John was at a crossroads. He could comply, put his hat away, and get on the plane, or he could walk away and risk everything. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about principle. He glanced around at the other passengers. Some were watching with interest, others trying to pretend they didn't notice. A few had their phones out, undoubtedly recording the scene. John didn't care about the spectacle anymore. His thoughts were consumed by the decision in front of him. "I'm not here to make a scene, but I won't be bullied," John said, the resolve in his voice clear. "You want me to take off my hat? I'm not going to do that. If that's how you run your airline, then maybe I don't need to be flying with you in the first place." Richard Stone's gaze was unwavering. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Harrison." "Maybe," John replied, his voice steady, "but it's my mistake to make." With that, John turned and walked away from the gate, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He could hear the murmurs of the other passengers, some of them no doubt agreeing with him, while others probably thought he was overreacting. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had taken a stand. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this wasn't just about a flight. This was a moment that would change everything. The entire incident, his decision to walk away, was bigger than him. It would resonate in ways he couldn't yet imagine, stirring up a storm of opinions, debates, and consequences. And he had no idea how it would all unfold. But as he made his way through the terminal, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The ripple effect had already started, and he had no idea where it would end. The tension in the room felt suffocating as John stood in line at the boarding gate, his hands shaking slightly. It wasn't the flight that made him nervous, nor was it the looming uncertainty of his business trip. No, it was the undeniable feeling of eyes on him, the weight of judgment coming from every direction. He had never thought much about his appearance, never believed in wearing labels that screamed louder than his actions. But today, he had put on the red MAGA hat, something he had done countless times before without thinking twice. It had become a symbol of his personal beliefs, of standing up for what he thought was right. And yet, standing there in that crowded terminal, with people muttering and shooting glances in his direction, he realized just how much it had become a point of contention. The flight was supposed to be routine. He had to catch a plane for an important meeting, one that could potentially alter the trajectory of his company's future. But as he approached the gate, he noticed a stewardess glaring at him from behind the counter. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw him, and John felt a pang of discomfort. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but he tried to push it aside, chalking it up to the early morning rush and the stress of travel. He reached the counter, ready to hand over his ticket when the stewardess spoke up, her voice laced with authority but also something else, something that hinted at personal disapproval. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, barely making eye contact. "But I'm afraid you won't be able to board the flight today." John blinked, a wave of confusion sweeping over him. He looked around the crowded terminal, wondering if there had been a misunderstanding. He wasn't sure if he had heard her right. "Excuse me? I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I understand. Is there a problem with my ticket?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm and polite. The stewardess glanced down at the screen in front of her, then back at John. "No, your ticket is fine. The issue is with your hat, sir. We cannot allow passengers to board while wearing a hat that could be considered a political statement. It's a violation of the airline's policy." John's mind raced, his pulse quickening as his heart pounded in his chest. "Wait a minute, are you saying my hat is the problem?" He gestured toward the MAGA hat perched on his head. "This is just a hat. I've worn it on flights before without any issue. It's not offensive. It's just—" "Sir, I understand what you're trying to say, but the policy is clear. We cannot allow any attire that could cause a disruption or promote divisiveness. You need to remove the hat or I'll have to ask you to leave the gate area," she insisted, her tone growing firmer. The words stung, and for a brief moment, John felt the blood rush to his face. His mind raced with confusion and frustration. How had things escalated this far? The hat was a statement, yes, but it wasn't a threat, nor was it intended to cause harm. He had worn it on flights before without issue, but now, standing before this stewardess, it felt like he was being attacked for something he believed in. A thought crossed his mind: was this a personal attack, or was it simply a misunderstanding? But there was no time for those thoughts to take root. The confrontation was happening, and he had to react. "I'm not taking off my hat," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This is my right, my choice. I've worn it countless times without incident. Why is it a problem now? I'm just trying to get to my destination like everyone else." The stewardess's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm just following orders. I don't make the rules, but I have to enforce them. If you refuse to comply, I will have to ask security to escort you from the area." John's mind swirled with the weight of the decision. Should he back down? Should he remove the hat and comply just to get through the day, to avoid making a scene? Or should he stand firm and face the consequences of his actions? In that moment, something inside him shifted. He couldn't back down, not now. Not for something so trivial, but so important. His belief in his right to wear that hat, his right to be who he was far more important than any flight. "No," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I'm not taking off my hat. I'll take the consequences. If I can't fly today, then I'll figure it out, but I won't be bullied into changing who I am." The stewardess's eyes widened for a moment, her lips tightening as if she hadn't expected that response. She glanced over at her supervisor, who had been watching from the side, before turning back to John. "I'm sorry, sir," she said coolly. "But I must insist. You can't board with that hat on." John could feel his heart racing, the adrenaline surging through his veins. But he stood his ground, refusing to back down. As the situation unfolded, a small crowd began to gather behind him, their curiosity piqued by the altercation. Some people were already whispering, and John couldn't help but notice the judgment in their eyes. A few of them even seemed to nod in approval of the stewardess's stance, while others watched in silence, waiting for the next move. It felt like everything was spinning out of control. John's throat tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. How had his simple choice of attire led to this? He had worn that hat countless times before, in far more crowded and charged environments, but now, here in this airport, it had become a flashpoint. A few moments later, a security guard arrived, walking briskly toward them. The stewardess stepped aside, and the guard addressed John. His presence only intensified the tension in the air. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the gate area if you don't remove the hat," the security officer said, his tone professional but stern. John's mind raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a hat, it was about a broader issue. It was about his identity, his freedom to express himself, and the ever-growing division in the country. He felt trapped, as though he had been thrust into a political battle he hadn't chosen but was now forced to participate in. If he backed down now, he would be silencing a part of himself, the part that had always fought for the right to stand up for his beliefs. "I'm not going anywhere," John said, his voice steady but firm. "If you want to remove me, you'll have to do it physically. But I'm not taking off my hat." The security guard looked at him for a long moment, seemingly weighing the situation. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded and turned to the stewardess. "Let him go. But make sure it doesn't happen again. If he causes any disruption, we'll have to take further action." John let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The stewardess glared at him one last time before walking away, muttering something under her breath. As he turned to walk toward the boarding gate, John couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication mixed with disbelief. What had started as a normal flight had turned into something far more significant, an experience that would alter his life in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As he sat down in the boarding area, waiting for his flight to be called, the weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about the hat. It was about a country divided, a society struggling with its identity, and a man caught in the middle of it all. He had chosen to stand firm, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than he could see, something far bigger than him, than his hat, than any of this. John wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: this moment, this decision, would follow him for the rest of his life. The consequences of his choice, whatever they might be, would shape his future in ways he could never have predicted. And as the plane finally began to board, John couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would this simple act of defiance come to define him, or would it be the catalyst for something even bigger, something that would force him to confront the forces that were shaping his life, his country, and his very identity? Only time would tell. John left the airport with a heavy heart and a mind filled with uncertainty. As he walked through the terminal, his thoughts swirled in confusion, frustration, and disbelief. He had made the decision to stand his ground, to fight for his right to wear his hat, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just opened a door to something much bigger than a simple airline dispute. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his wife, Emily. "Everything okay? I saw the news. What happened?" John paused outside the airport doors, squinting at the bright sunlight. The warmth of the day contrasted sharply with the cold sense of betrayal he felt. He was in no mood to explain just yet, but Emily's concern tugged at him. He quickly typed a response: "I'm fine. I'll call you later." But as he hit send, he noticed the news vans lined up outside the terminal, reporters hustling to gather footage. The entire situation was already being covered, his name and the airlines in the headlines. The events that had just transpired were far from ordinary, and John knew it was only a matter of time before the media would twist the story to fit their narrative. He couldn't help but feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. He took a seat on a nearby bench, trying to collect himself. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from his colleague, Mark, who had been with him during many of his business trips. "Man, I saw what happened at the airport. Are you okay? This is all over social media." John took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was settling in, and he knew he had to make a decision about how to handle it. The problem was bigger than just one instance. It was a reflection of a growing tension in society, a political and social divide that was starting to seep into all corners of life. The incident at the airport was only the tip of the iceberg, and John couldn't help but wonder if he had just become a pawn in a much larger game. As he sat there, considering his next steps, he saw people walking by, some of them glancing over at him. A few recognized him from the news coverage and muttered to each other. He could feel their eyes on him, some sympathetic, others critical. It was as if the world had suddenly split into two factions, and he was caught in the middle. He had always prided himself on being a private person, but now it felt as though every detail of his life was being scrutinized under a microscope. The ride home was long and quiet. His thoughts were consumed by the events that had unfolded. The more he thought about it, the more he questioned his actions. Was he too quick to make a stand? Had he overreacted? He knew that wearing the MAGA hat wasn't just a political statement, it was a part of his identity. It wasn't just about politics for him, it was about being true to himself. But now, faced with the consequences, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been worth it. When he finally got home, Emily was waiting for him in the living room. She stood up as he walked in, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "John, what happened?" she asked softly, her voice laced with worry. John ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the words to explain the situation. "I'm fine, Em. But it's a mess. The airline refused to let me board because of my hat. They said it was against their policy." Emily's face flushed with confusion. "What do you mean, against their policy? What kind of policy is that?" "I don't know, but it was clear they weren't going to let me on the flight unless I took it off," John explained. "And I wasn't going to do that. I'm not just going to change who I am because someone tells me to." The tension in the room grew palpable as Emily processed his words. "John, I get it. But this is a big deal. People are already talking about it. The whole thing is blowing up online." John let out a deep sigh and sank onto the couch. "I know, I saw the news vans. The whole thing feels like it's spiraling out of control. I didn't expect it to go this far. I thought I was just standing up for myself, for my rights, but now it's bigger than that." Emily sat down beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "So, what now? What do we do about it?" John shook his head, feeling a growing sense of dread. He had no clear answers, no plan for what came next. He had always been someone who prided himself on thinking things through, making decisions with careful consideration. But in this case, everything had felt like it was happening in fast forward, each moment pushing him forward without time to reflect. The following days were a blur. John's story dominated the media, the footage from the airport being replayed over and over again. He was painted in two very different lights. To some, he was a hero standing up for his beliefs in the face of oppressive corporate policies. To others, he was an out-of-touch man clinging to a political symbol that had no place in modern society. The divisiveness was evident in the comments section of every article, the heated debates in social media threads, and even in the conversations around town. People who had never met John were now judging him, deciding which side of the political divide he belonged to. The fallout from the incident wasn't just about the media coverage, it was about the conversations it sparked in his community. Friends and acquaintances who had once been cordial now avoided eye contact or openly questioned him. Some were supportive, reaching out to offer their solidarity. But others, the ones who didn't share his beliefs, were quick to distance themselves. The restaurant where he had always been a regular seemed quieter when he walked in, the usual nods and smiles replaced with uncomfortable silence. It wasn't just the personal relationships that were shifting. John's business life was beginning to feel the effects as well. His phone rang less frequently, his email inbox quieter than usual. Some clients had even begun to question whether they wanted to continue working with someone so publicly embroiled in controversy. The deal he had been so focused on, a major business venture that had taken months to set up, was now on the verge of collapse. The CEO of the company, who had previously been enthusiastic about the partnership, sent a terse email canceling their upcoming meeting. There was no explanation, just a brief note stating they no longer felt comfortable moving forward. John had to come to terms with the reality that this wasn't just about a flight or a hat. This was about the very fabric of his identity being put to the test. His decision to wear that hat, to stand by it, had irrevocably altered the course of his life. It had cost him not just a flight, but a reputation, relationships, and business opportunities. As the days went on, he found himself wrestling with the weight of the decision. Was it worth it? Was standing up for his beliefs, for his right to wear that hat, truly worth the personal cost? His conscience told him he had done the right thing. But his heart and mind struggled with the harsh reality of the consequences. And then, as if the universe had decided to give him one last blow, he received a call from the airline. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Mr. Harrison, I'm calling to inform you that we've decided to revoke your frequent flyer status due to your conduct at the airport." The words stung like a slap across the face. Frequent flyer status, something he had earned through years of loyalty, now meant nothing. "Is that really necessary?" John asked, his voice shaking with the sudden rush of emotion. "I'm afraid so," the airline representative replied. "The incident caused a significant disruption, and we've received numerous complaints. We feel that your actions go against the values we uphold as a company." John stood there, his mind racing, but the words didn't come. The call ended abruptly, leaving him standing in silence, feeling more isolated than ever before. This was his new reality. It wasn't just the fallout from the airport incident. It was the realization that standing up for his beliefs had consequences that reached far beyond anything he had anticipated. John knew that he would never be the same. And neither would the community that had once been so familiar, so supportive, now divided by a moment in time that none of them could. The days following the incident seemed to blur together for John, each one filled with a new wave of challenges, realizations, and reflections. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of isolation. Everywhere he turned, it seemed like the world was shifting, each person he encountered with an opinion, each interaction colored by the decisions he had made. It was as if the airport incident had opened a door to a realm he hadn't fully understood until now, and with each passing day, the door was swinging wider, revealing more unsettling truths. At first, the reactions from his friends and family were mixed. His best friend, Mark, who had reached out to him after the incident, came to visit one afternoon. Mark had always been the type to look at the world pragmatically, to approach every situation with logic and a sense of balance. But even he couldn't fully comprehend what had transpired. Sitting at John's kitchen table, he stared at his friend for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether the man he had known for years had somehow changed in the process. "John," Mark began, his voice tentative. "I get why you did it. I really do. But now it's everywhere. You can't go online without seeing your face. People are talking about you. Talking about this like it's some kind of statement. And you know as well as I do, you've got some enemies now." John let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temples. The weight of the situation was starting to suffocate him. "I didn't think it would go this far, Mark. I really didn't. All I wanted was to stand up for something, you know? To stand up for what I believe in. And now, everything is spinning out of control. I can't even go to the store without people whispering." Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Look, I know you've got strong feelings about this, but you've got to realize the bigger picture. This isn't just about you anymore. It's become about everyone. The media's turned you into a symbol, and whether you like it or not, people are using you to push their own agendas. You've got to decide if this is really what you want." John paused, his gaze falling to the floor as he considered Mark's words. He had been so focused on his own principles, on standing up for what he thought was right, that he hadn't fully grasped the consequences of making himself a public figure in such a divisive moment. The comments online, the debates, the discussions around town, they weren't about the man he was, but about the statement he had become. To some, he was a hero. To others, a villain. To the airline, he was a liability. "What am I supposed to do now?" John asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a weight he couldn't shake off. "I can't just pretend it didn't happen. I can't go back to being the guy I was before." Mark shook his head slowly. "I don't have the answers, man. But you've got to decide what kind of person you want to be in the long run. Do you want to be defined by this one moment, or do you want to find a way to take control of the narrative? You can't let other people decide for you. John didn't have an answer, but as Mark left, he felt the weight of his friend's words settle heavily on his shoulders. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, interviews, and media attention. The story had gone viral, and everyone seemed to have something to say about it. Some praised John for his bravery, while others condemned him for his actions. The airline's decision to revoke his frequent flyer status had become a talking point, and soon, other passengers began coming forward with their own stories, some defending John's right to express his beliefs, others calling for stronger policies to prevent such disruptive behavior on flights. John tried to keep his head down, to weather the storm, but the pressure was beginning to feel unbearable. He had always been a private person, preferring to avoid confrontation, but now, it seemed like the entire world was watching. Even the smallest actions, ordering a coffee at the local cafe, walking into his office, felt like they were under a microscope. As the media frenzy continued, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at John's office, handwritten and unsigned. The letter read, "I saw what happened at the airport, and I wanted to tell you that you're not alone. There are more of us who feel the same way you do. Don't let the media or the company make you think you're wrong. Your beliefs matter. You matter." The words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within him. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to remind him that, despite the noise, he wasn't alone in his beliefs. Maybe he hadn't lost everything, maybe there were still people out there who understood him. But the more John thought about it, the more he realized that his fight wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a symbol of something larger, a microcosm of the division that had been festering in the country for years. His story wasn't just about a man wearing a hat, it was about the bigger cultural and political battles that were being fought every day. It was about how personal identity and political expression had become battlegrounds in a country that was struggling to understand itself. At work, things were starting to unravel. Clients were pulling back, not wanting to associate with him after his newfound notoriety. He had been forced to cancel meetings and reschedule business trips, unsure of how to proceed. The partnerships he had worked so hard to build were beginning to fracture, the damage done by his actions becoming more apparent with each passing day. The worst part was that John could feel it. People were no longer treating him as a colleague or a businessman, they were treating him like a problem to be avoided, a liability to be distanced from. One afternoon, as John sat in his office, staring at a mountain of emails he had yet to respond to, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" John answered cautiously. "Mr. Harrison?" The voice on the other end was smooth, authoritative. "This is Richard Stone from the airline. I'm calling to speak with you about your recent actions." John felt a sudden tightness in his chest, the weight of the past few days crashing down on him. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing Stone's voice again felt like a punch to the gut. "I'm listening," John said, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed his tension. "We've had time to review the situation, and after careful consideration, we'd like to offer you an opportunity to resolve this matter amicably," Stone continued. "We understand your frustrations, Mr. Harrison. But the attention this incident has garnered has become a distraction, and we'd like to find a way to move forward." John's heart raced as he tried to process the words. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "It means that we're willing to reinstate your frequent flyer status and offer you an apology for the way the situation was handled. However, we do expect a public statement from you to clarify your position and to assure the public that this matter is behind us. In exchange, we'll consider this matter closed and will offer you a path forward with our airline." John's mind spun. An apology? A public statement? He had stood by his beliefs, and now the airline was offering him a way out, if only he would publicly back down, if only he would concede that it was all just a misunderstanding. It was an opportunity to restore his reputation, to repair the damage, but at what cost? Was this really the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of man who apologized for standing firm? Was this what it had all come to? He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Was he willing to compromise his principles for a second chance? Would he allow himself to be silenced, to become part of the very system that had tried to suppress him in the first place? The phone call ended with a vague promise to talk again soon, but John didn't feel any relief. Instead, he felt more uncertain than ever. The pressure was mounting, the consequences of his choices spreading in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had seemed like a fight for his beliefs now felt like a never-ending struggle with no clear resolution. The world had shifted under his feet, and as he sat alone in his office, he had no idea where it would take him next. John spent the following days in a haze of uncertainty, pacing back and forth, unable to find peace in his own thoughts. He had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions, to weigh the consequences and choose a path that felt right. But now, every step forward seemed clouded by doubt, every action leading him deeper into a maze of confusion. The phone call from Richard Stone, the airline representative, had left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. The airline's offer of reinstating his frequent flyer status and apologizing for the way they had handled the situation seemed like a lifeline, but at what cost? The condition, the public apology and a statement to back down, felt like a betrayal. It wasn't just about the hat anymore, it was about his integrity, his identity, and the very essence of who he was. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake, to give in to the pressure. His wife, Emily, had been trying to support him through the chaos, but even she seemed to be at a loss. Every conversation they had lately felt strained, as if they were both tiptoeing around a subject that neither of them could fully address. "John," she said one night after dinner, her voice cautious, "have you thought about what you want to do? I know this whole thing is exhausting, but you've got to make a decision. Do you want to continue down this road, or is it time to let it go?" John stared at his plate, the fork in his hand unmoving. He wasn't hungry anymore. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I don't know if I can let it go. But I don't know if I can keep going, either. Everything's changed. I've changed." Emily reached across the table, her hand gently resting on his. "Maybe you haven't changed as much as you think. Maybe you're just realizing what's really important to you. And maybe that's not something anyone else can decide for you." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so much time focusing on the external pressures, the noise of the world, that he had lost sight of the core of who he was. Was he really fighting for his beliefs, or was he fighting just to prove a point, to show the world that he wasn't going to be pushed around? What if the fight wasn't worth the cost? What if standing firm meant losing everything he had worked for, his business, his relationships, his peace of mind? That night, as he lay in bed beside Emily, he tried to sleep, but the weight of the decision pressed on him like a stone. He replayed the events in his mind over and over, the confrontation at the airport, the media circus that had followed. He could hear the voices of strangers, the judgment in their words, the way they had twisted his actions to fit their own narratives. But more than anything, he remembered how he had felt in that moment when the stewardess had turned him away, the feeling of standing up for what he believed in, of asserting his right to be who he was. That was what had driven him to make the choice, to endure the backlash. He couldn't let that go, not without losing a part of himself. The next morning, John made a decision. He wasn't going to accept the airline's offer. He wasn't going to back down, not this time. He was going to take control of the situation and use it as an opportunity to speak his truth, no matter the cost. He called Richard Stone back, his voice steady but resolute. "I've thought it over," John said, "and I've made my decision. I'm not going to issue a public apology. I'm not going to pretend that what happened wasn't important. It was. It's who I am. And I won't apologize for that. The conversation was tense, but in the end, Stone accepted his decision. The airline would not reinstate his frequent flyer status, and the story would remain part of the public record. But in that moment, John felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He was no longer fighting for the approval of others. He was fighting for himself. The fallout from his decision was immediate and intense. News outlets continued to cover the story, but now, instead of being the subject of ridicule, John's stance began to resonate with a different audience. Social media, which had once been a place of disdain and judgment, began to shift. Supporters of his decision started to come forward, sharing their own stories of standing up for their beliefs, of facing criticism for speaking their truth. It was as if John's story had become a rallying cry for those who had felt marginalized, those who had been told that their voices didn't matter. People began to see him not as a man who had simply worn a hat, but as a man who had refused to be silenced. As the weeks went on, John's life began to stabilize, but it was different now. The weight of the controversy had left scars, both on him and on the community. He was no longer just John Harrison, the businessman or the neighbor. He was John Harrison, the man who had stood up for his beliefs in the face of overwhelming pressure. The relationships he had once taken for granted, those with clients, friends, and acquaintances, were now tinged with uncertainty. Some had distanced themselves, unable to reconcile his actions with their own views. Others, however, had come forward with support, offering apologies for the way they had judged him in the beginning. At work, things were slowly returning to normal. Some clients had walked away, but others had rallied behind him, impressed by his unwavering stance. The business deals that had once seemed precarious began to gain traction again, though John knew they were no longer as secure as they had once been. His reputation had changed, for better or worse, but it was his reputation now, and he would stand by it. One evening, as John sat in his home office, reading through emails and reports, Emily came in with a cup of coffee. She set it down beside him and sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice gentle. John looked up, his eyes tired but calm. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About what happened, what it means, where we go from here." Emily smiled softly. "And what have you decided?" John paused, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last light of day was fading. "I've decided that I'm okay with what happened. I'm not going to regret it, even if it cost me some things. I've learned that sometimes standing firm means losing things you thought you couldn't live without. But it also means gaining something more, something deeper. It's not about the hat, or the airline, or the media. It's about knowing that I stood up for myself, for my beliefs, and that I didn't let anyone tell me who I should be." Emily reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'm proud of you, John. I know it wasn't easy. But I can see it now, you're not just the man you were before. You're someone who has learned to live with his choices, for better or worse. And that's something." John smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. The battle hadn't been easy, and the consequences would linger for a long time, but he had found something more important than external approval. He had found his own truth, and that truth was worth more than anything else. The community may have been divided, and the world may have judged him, but he knew that the only judgment that truly mattered was his own. He had made his choice, and now, with a sense of resolve, he was ready to face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to embrace it.